In this part of Galileo's life, the storm clouds are beginning to gather. We can see it in phases. First, the Dominican friars at San Marco in Florence start gathering evidence against Galileo. He's made enemies of the friars by being cavalier in dissing the church and in dissing their traditions of holding to Aristotelian physics in particular. These friars denounce him to the Roman Inquisition. The Roman Inquisition was an instrument of the Counter-Reformation, formed after the Protestant Church split off from the Catholic Church under Martin Luther. Counter-Reformation was designed to push back and solidify the Catholic hold over a number of countries in Southern Europe. It was administered by the Holy Office of the Vatican, and they were permitted to use any means necessary to get their way, including torture. Galileo also was subject to the Index of Forbidden Books. This was an organized system of censorship that the Church set up and started in 1559, just after the time of Copernicus. It's amazing to realize that the Index of Forbidden Books was not actually fully abolished until 1966. Another warning to Galileo was the fate of Giordano Bruno, a Dominican friar who was born in 1548. He wrote mystical writings with scientific content. He proposed an infinite universe. He proposed it was implausible that the stars would not be worlds like the sun and have orbiting planets like the Earth. And to him, it was illogical that there would not be life on those planets, including intelligent life like humans. And he proposed that there was an infinite amount of life. This was an extraordinary supposition for the day, with no evidence really to support it. He was condemned as a heretic, not purely for these scientific views, but he had some unorthodox views within his religion, and he was burned at the stake. We can visualize the scene. All you have to do is go to Rome, Campo de Fiore in the middle of Rome, and there is a statue of the Dominican friar, Giordano Bruno. Well, in the year 1600, having been condemned as an impenitent and pertinacious heretic, as the rap sheet read, he was taken to the square in an ox cart covered in straw and manure and being mocked by the crowd. Public executions were for the crowds and the masses in those days, so we can imagine almost a carnival-like scene with thousands of people crowded into the square and vendors selling food, children, women, children, people of all ages there for the spectacle of the execution. He was carried around the square in the ox cart and then taken to the center where a pyre was built. A centurion or a soldier walked forward and asked for a final time that he repent. He denied it. He refused to repent. And so the soldier moved forward and drove a nail through his tongue into his jaw to stop him spouting heresy as he died. That was a brutal act. A slightly more merciful act came when another soldier hung a bag of gunpowder around his neck, which would speed his demise once the flames had started. And so Bruno was burned at the stake in the year 1600. And Galileo, knowing of this, could have had no illusions as to what might happen if you fell foul of the Catholic Church. Galileo was in Rome, and he was called to Rome, and he met with Cardinal Bellarmine in 1616. Cardinal Bellarmine was a civilized, cultured, very well-educated man, and not radically conservative at all. But Galileo had failed to prevent the official church ban on Copernicanism, and Copernicus's book has placed on the forbidden books list until 1835, actually. And Galileo was made to promise not to hold or defend the Copernican theory. He was allowed to talk about it in a hypothetical sense, purely as a mathematical convenience to describe observations. And he seeks and obtains a signed letter from Bellarmine as proof of this agreement, which becomes evidence in his later trial. So they essentially reached a compromise. Bellarmine said, just don't talk about it as the absolute truth. Just say that it's a hypothesis or it's a mathematical theory, but just don't make trouble. Friends and enemies were growing, though. Galileo had a powerful new friend and patron in Maffeo Barberini. Barberini was a cultured and sophisticated member of the clergy and a supporter of art and science. he was elected Pope Urban VIII in 1623 and maintained friendly ties with Galileo. So Galileo, perhaps wrongly, felt encouraged by his friendship with the new pope to continue to explore Copernican idea, if only as a hypothesis. But meanwhile, he's making powerful enemies amongst Jesuits in the Catholic Church. So while he might have the good graces of the Pope, down the chain of command in the Catholic Church and the Vatican, he has a lot of enemies. He antagonizes Christoph Scheiner, a highly esteemed Jesuit priest, in an argument over the nature of sunspots, and another senior Jesuit, Orazio Grassi, in an argument over a theory of comets. So he's pissing off the priests in astronomical arguments and not just about Copernicanism. This is the book that kind of was the straw that broke the camel's back. This is a book that was a dialogue about two worldviews. It's a dialogue concerning two chief world systems. It's his Copernican manifesto, and he wrote it deliberately in Italian to reach a wide audience in 1632. The dialogue has three characters: Sagredo, who's the mediator; Simplicio is an Aristotelian philosopher, and Salviati seems to be speaking for Galileo. Simplicio puts up ineffectual arguments that the other two knock down and ridicule. Now, Galileo would claim that Simplicio is named after a 6th century commentator on Aristotle, and the word also is the root of simpleton. But Galileo has Simplicio mouth Pope Urban's views on God's omnipotence. So he puts his friend and patron and the Pope words into Simplicio's mouth. Galileo's Jesuit enemies seize on this immediately and spread the word that Simplicio is Urban VIII, and it gets to the Pope, and the Pope is outraged. And so Galileo is brought in front of the Inquisition. The charge is read by Cardinal Maculano. The charge is suspicion of heresy. He's getting the benefit of the doubt here with suspicion. The prosecution's case is that Galileo violated a papal injunction of 1616 banning Copernicanism. And the primary evidence is the unsigned document saying that he was told not to hold, defend, or teach the idea of Copernicus. Galileo, for his part, maintains he did not violate the papal injunction, and he holds up his signed letter from Cardinal Bellarmine. In addition, Galileo had obtained the imprimatur for the dialogue according to the rules, so he published it according to the Catholic Church rules. Now we go to the trial. The Vatican needed to assert its authority and send a message to other possible dissenters. The fix was in. Galileo had to be found guilty. Under threat of torture, he was actually taken into a back room where the Inquisition was held and shown the instruments of torture. And these were not old rusty tools in iron. They were well oiled, ready to use, and had been used. Galileo accepted the plea bargain, and he recanted. And we see his confession and his recanting on the right. It says, "With sincere heart and unfeigned faith, I abjure, curse, and detest my errors. I swear that in future I will never again say or assert verbally or in writing anything to encourage this suspicion." The punishment was life imprisonment, commuted to house arrest, which was a rather gentle ending. He was sent to Via Eugioio near Arcetri in Florence. I visited his house. It's a beautiful place. He spent the last 11 years of his life there, blind finally from too many careless observations of the sun. Now, as you can see, it's not a terrible place to be under house arrest. It's on a hill outside Florence. You can see on the right the view from his window. There's a wine cellar in the basement. He had servants. He had plenty of time and peace to write up his physics and his work for his last 12 years. He was allowed visitors, so many of the leading lights of Europe intellectually came to see him, but still, he was much diminished by the end of his life. And so he writes in a letter to a friend, and you see here the sad Galileo in a painting by Peter Paul Rubens. He writes, "Your dear friend and servant Galileo has been for the last month hopelessly blind, so that this heaven, this earth, this universe, which I, by my marvelous discoveries and clear demonstrations, have enlarged 100,000 times beyond the belief of the wise men of bygone ages, henceforward from me is shrunk into such a small space as is filled by my bodily sensations. The Catholic Church ordered Galileo to recant his claim. He did, and he died under house arrest. His book on the subject was finally removed from the Church's index of banned list books in 1835. It took a long time. However, by then the locus of astronomy had shifted to the northern countries of Europe. It's worth remembering that when he was in trouble with the Church, Kepler and others who lived in northern Europe said, "Come to stay with us. We'll give you a position in one of our universities. We don't have the same problems here in Protestant countries as you do with the Catholic Church. You'll be able to say what you want, teach what you want." So he had offers. He had places he could have gone to escape what happened to him. But he was loyal, and loyal to his family, loyal to his country. However, there was a sort of cussed aspect of this, where he sort of willed the conflict on, and it did happen. The collision was set, and he was part of that collision too. Now, the wheels of the Church moved slowly, and it actually took until John Paul II in 1992 before they finally admitted a modest amount of error and formally vindicated Galileo, just a little late. So let's review Galileo with a cartoon history. He is a major figure in the history of science. We see at the start of his life that he had to choose what he was going to study, and he turned his back on medicine and went towards natural science. He learned by dropping falling objects that they moved in ways that were not as described by Aristotle. So here he is acting as an experimental physicist. He was following the scientific method, and Aristotle's logic was wrong, and so he was willing to reject the logic of Aristotle. He also was willing to reject the geocentric model, which had the Earth at the center of the solar system. There were many reasons why this simply didn't make sense to him. He instead believed, and had evidence to support, the heliocentric idea that the Earth was spinning and in motion around the Sun, and that could explain many observations. We see his role in the experimental method. Science is based on observation of the natural world and experimentation. This idea begins with Galileo, and he's best exponent of it. He used the telescope, while not inventing it, to make beautiful observations of the night sky. He also improved the technology by more than a factor of 10. And he was an ardent supporter of Copernicus. And he really was the central reason that the Copernican idea took root in the world of ideas of intellectuals and scientists by the time he died. He's also the precursor of modern science. We can see a straight path through from the way Galileo did his experiments to a modern scientific lab. The problem with the Church was almost inevitable, because he was saying things that the Church simply was not willing to have someone say in public. The moon was not a perfect object. Remember, the Church was beholden to the ideas of Aristotelian physics, because Aristotelian physics had been merged into Catholic and Christian theology by this time. So to go against Aristotle at the level that Galileo did was to go against Catholic dogma. And of course, this had to end badly. So while he was called in front of the Church, the Inquisition was there, and he was shown the instruments of torture. This was never going to end well. And he does end his life under house arrest, a diminished man and blind. But now, Galileo's books can be freely bought. He's been uncensored and unshackled, and anyone can read the wonderful things that Galileo developed. And he also now has moved into the popular culture.
Thunderbolt and lightning, very, very frightening me.
Galileo, Galileo, Galileo Figaro.
Magnifico!
And that's the end of this topic.